Hi guys, Bill here. Now I've said this before, but I think it's worth repeating. Although I am an atheist, I like churches. One of the biggest reasons that I like them is the way that they support youth organisations. The specifics don't really matter, you know, the Scouts, the Boys Brigade, whatever. The important part is that they support efforts to get children thinking and acting as part of the local community. It brings some perspective into their lives. By encouraging them to make some small efforts on another's behalf, they help prepare them for adult life in a way that other forms of education just don't seem to care about anymore. Learning to care about our fellow human beings is worthwhile in and of itself. The personal benefit in terms of having a good conscience, a sense of worth and purpose, self-confidence and an appreciation of the wider community are all worth having. But the best part is the way that it brings the whole local community together. Older people especially gain a great deal by knowing that the area they live in has lots of nice kids doing good deeds. Now naturally that filters back down to the organisations and ultimately back to the kids themselves, so everybody wins. We get that village feeling of belonging to a place, even though we live in the heart of a city. Now obviously, the kids who don't belong to these organisations aren't necessarily bad kids, but if they become self-centred and insular, they start losing the opportunity to demonstrate their worth to the wider community. Older people especially become suspicious, even frightened, of the young people round about them. They pass their fears along, and inevitably the police presence in an area increases. Minor incidents start to be seen as something more symptomatic of broader problems. Being seen as others by the community at large makes those kids become defensive, and inevitably tension mounts. The difference between a sink estate and a council scheme is arbitrary. You know, there's lots of low income families living in mainly social housing in both, which should make them appear to be the same thing. But if you're growing up in a place where you know your neighbours and you can say hello to everybody you meet, a place where the kids that accost you want to know if you want a hand bringing your bin out, not to throw some petty insult at you, then you know that you're in a nice area, and you probably consider yourself very fortunate not to live in the dreaded sink estate. The notion that it all stems from the kids having good manners probably hasn't even occurred to most people. It's like most things in life. The real effort to bring civility and order into our lives is completely invisible. Now, if you have got daughters, please consider enrolling them into something along the lines of this kind of activity. It really might be the only time in their lives outside of your own home where they're taught to put somebody else's thoughts, feelings and needs before their own. It's a rare but precious thing in this day and age. Now the effect on council estates is fairly obvious and pretty well known. When an area is regenerated, they always make major efforts into creating and supporting youth groups as part of the regeneration process. But the effects on better off areas aren't quite so well documented. It's always fascinated me how many of Britain's football hooligans turned out to be from pretty affluent backgrounds. And likewise the recent riots in London and some of our other major cities. A whole bunch of the looters were very well heeled. And that makes me think about feminists. Without an imperative to look after others, are our young women doomed to become self-centred, selfish, and blind to the predicament of others? When you think about it, little boys are often told not to do things, even while their female classmates or siblings are positively encouraged to do exactly the same thing. You know, crying, for instance, or complaining about being frightened or being uncomfortable. Now over time this has got to have an effect, surely. So what I'm getting at, in a sense, is, are we creating a more subtle variant of the kind of environment that creates Neds or chavs hanging around our streets? Can the extreme behaviour of self-serving hooligans and looters be echoed in the demanding, self-victimised cries of those who decide to identify with the feminist cause? Their demands always seem to be variants on "listen to me, I'm important." Their fears are always personal ones, not societal. They demand equality, but they only want equality in areas which have some bearing or relevance to being educated and middle class. And the corollary to all of that is that they're very casual about silencing critics by any way they can get away with. They've got a blatant disregard for any hardship or hazard that doesn't affect them. And they've got a studied boredom at the mention of any inequity outside of that privileged little white-collar world. It might explain the ridiculous obsession with poking their noses into events and pastimes which don't pander to them. If they can't differentiate between their own self-identity and the cause that they're following, then of course any activity which seems hostile or indifferent to feminism is an activity that's a threat to them. It explains, but it doesn't excuse. We don't put up with antisocial behaviour from Neds, hoolies or looters, even when we accept that their upbringing played a part in their circumstances. So why should special snowflakes be any different? Later, peeps.